Thanks, Lynn. Hi, morning, everyone. Really lovely to be given the opportunity to join you this morning, and thank you for your kind of starting interest. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you this morning. So my name is Helen Morris. I'm a senior probation officer, and I'm the Women's Strategic Lead for South Central Probation, which is Thames Valley and Hampshire. I've worked specifically with a focus on women for about the last 9 years. And I initially managed the women's specific team across Thames Valley, which at the time was quite a revolutionary approach in terms of how we worked maybe differently with men and women. And then for the last 3 years or so, I've held this specific strategic role. I'm incredibly passionate about women and the work that we do, about their experiences, about increasing other people's awareness of those and of the journey that women take through the criminal justice system. And I really hope to give you some insight into that today. So what am I thinking about covering? So we're looking at women I want to give you a bit of a background on women in the criminal justice system, just that starting position. Think about some policy, thinking about the kind of national and focus on women. I want to give you a bit of a profile of women across Thames Valley and West Berkshire, just to give you that both kind of bigger local context, but and specifically the local context within the area in which you're working. And in view of kind of the theme of this week and thinking about safeguarding, I'm going to do a bit of a spotlight on the sex industry and the approach, and obviously the women we work with, and pulling in the police to that. I'm going to give you a brief profile of having obviously anonymized, but thinking about the profile of some of the women that we might work with and thinking about what some of those issues are that might present to us. And a bit later on, we're going to be joined by one of the probation practitioners who specifically worked with women for a number of years. And for us to have a bit of a conversation around, what that's looked like for her and her reflections on working with women, bringing in that kind of safeguarding and vulnerability aspect. And then we'll have some time at the end for any reflections or any specific questions that you might have. So I really wanted to give you just some background on policy, and I think this is really important in terms of where we've got to currently, because certainly in my time of working with women in the criminal justice system, we've moved so far, and I'm really encouraged by that. But kind of where that's come from and the development of that, I think is really important. So to take you all the way back, in March 2006, Baroness Corston was asked by the Home Office to conduct a review of women in the criminal justice system who have particular vulnerabilities. And that was closely linked to the sad passing of around 6 women in H&P Style, which is a women's prison in the further north of the country. And it was looking at those specific case studies. So it was really focused on their experiences, but also widening out to look at women's experiences in the criminal justice system. So she spent a year investigating that. And in her report, revolutionary for the time, she identified that equal treatment of men and women does not necessarily result in equal outcomes. And she really asserted that it's timely to bring about a radical change in the way that we treat women throughout the whole of the criminal justice system. And that this wasn't just about those who are offending or have offended, but those that are also at risk of offending. And at the time, there'd been no other research or, as we say, quite radical conclusions around how we might go forward when working with women. Then in 2018 was the development of the female offender strategy. So His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, Her Majesty at the time, and the wider Ministry of Justice demonstrated that kind of commitment to addressing the issues around female offending to better protect the public, but also think about those different outcomes and different interventions for more kind of effective rehabilitation. And that strategy was the first of its kind. It set out a vision to see fewer women in custody, especially short-term sentences, with a greater proportion of women being managed in the community successfully. Also, set out the aims, thinking about those at risk for earlier intervention. How could we divert women away from the justice system? And where appropriate, could we look at better conditions in custody? Obviously, we're trying to avoid custody, but once women are in custody, we need to think about those kind of in that environment and how it can be looked at. So the strategy launched a program of work to kind of deliver, with the real tagline of delivering better outcomes for women. I've noticed some echoing. I'm going to mute and come off and see if that makes any difference. There we go. Hopefully that might have sorted. That's my off and on approach, is always one of those good things. Hopefully that might have made a difference for some people.
I'll keep an eye on the chat, Helen.
Sorry?
I'll keep an eye on the chat, Helen, and see.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Lynn. So fingers crossed the sound's okay for people. So yeah, the strategy was about delivering better outcomes for women, their kind of families, and the kind of wider community. Fast forward another year, and Lord Farmer did a review, and it's someone who's done quite a lot of research in terms of kind of people generally, does work on men too, around engagement in the criminal justice system, but also kind of what else is going on for those people. And he did a piece of research that really concluded that kind of strengthening family and kind of other relational ties across custody and the community through the lens of female offenders really was an important focus, and supporting women to build and maintain those relationships was actually key to general rehabilitation, but also reducing the intergenerational crime. The Concordat was another revolutionary focus on specifically women, and it's still a theme that is brought out now. So this looked at how different government departments, as well as more local agencies and other partners, needed to work together to identify and respond to the needs of women. And it agreed a kind of cross-government commitment to support women and an action plan to give effect to that commitment. And that really, for me, is the kind of overarching picture that we need to see also more locally. Since then, 4 years on from the publication of the Female Offender Strategy, we have the delivery plan. So a real kind of action focus. So what that looked at was, and as did the 1 year on progress report, really thought about what were the aims and the strategies of the Female Offender Strategy back from 2018, and how could that be developed, what progress had been made. And actually, in addition to the 3 initial aims, earlier intervention, how can we divert women away? Improving community sentences, so work with probation and what could we do differently? Reducing the number of women going into custody and making custody more effective. We also needed to think about the effective resettlement of women going back into the community as that different tangent of what's that journey like for women, and how do we, as a whole system, if you like, or that joint cross-government department, cross-agency, how could we look at the focus on the factors most deemed to work with women in those scenarios? How could we think about access to services, and how could we progress any barriers that we might be seeing for those women? So a very quick snapshot of the kind of building momentum, and you'll notice some of those are really very much in the last 5 years. There was quite a delay between the Corsten report back in 2007 and that first strategy, which was a number of years in the making. But what we're seeing now is a kind of year-on-year focus on how the criminal justice system can work to better address the needs of women. I wanted to just pull out this quote specifically from the Female Offender Strategy, and it's: if we're to rehabilitate female offenders successfully and reduce reoffending, our workforce must understand the factors that drive women's offending behaviour, and greater likelihood that gender-informed interventions will be effective. So just us with that different lens and that different focus. And perhaps I hope that today will also be that ability for you to perhaps view women in the criminal justice system with a slightly different lens. So I thought I'd start by giving you a bit of some statistics and a bit of a rounded view, and we'll do a couple of slides that just focus on this really, that really begin to build the profile of women in the criminal justice system. So back in 2019, 33% of women remanded into prison by the magistrates and 40% by the Crown Court did not go on to receive a custodial sentence. So we're starting to build a picture of the type of offences that some women might go into custody for, but also the type of offences that they might be remanded into custody for and the reason for that. So starting to look at what is a driver quite often around the kind of vulnerability for women and the kind of custody being deemed a place of safety and what that looks like. The context of that is that women tend to commit less serious offences. We do have some risky women that we manage, but proportionately far fewer than you would find in the cohort of men that we manage. But they are more likely to be serving a short prison sentence. 72% of females that went into prison in 2022 were for non-violent crimes. So that's one of the leading offences that we manage women for in the community, some of which have got a custodial sentence for, is shoplifting. That's the driving offence that we manage most women for. And if we think about, just as a headline, what prison is termed for as a method of public protection, there are questions around that for women. So 70% of sentences that started in 2022 were for less than 12 months compared to half. So you're looking at half of men got a sentence for less than 12 months and almost 2/3 of women get a sentence of less than 12 months. When I last checked some data around 6 months ago, the average sentence for a woman was 7 weeks in total. So you're looking at 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks, maybe even less in terms of what else might be going for them serving in custody. So we're starting to build a picture of the type of offences, whether women might be remanded, what length of sentence they get. So not only are they getting a custodial sentence, but that's quite often really short. It's estimated that nearly 60% of women who have offended have experienced some kind of domestic abuse or abuse. The true figure is likely to be much higher. So this statistic is gained from women going into custody and their disclosures, and it's felt that this is likely to be that rate because of people feeling, or women feeling, slightly safer when in custody to be able to disclose. But actually, there will still be a proportion of those women who still don't feel safe enough to disclose at that point. So the reality that a number of the women, certainly we recognise that we manage on probation, are victims themselves. And so we have to manage both those kind of tangents and aspects of the women that we're managing. Really important part of this is that 17,000 children are affected by maternal imprisonment each year. So the majority of women that go into custody that have children will find that those children are displaced in other areas. It might be with family members, or it might be into the care system, but frequently they have to move home if their mother is their primary and most dependent carer. And that has a huge impact. So we're always really mindful about how we might manage that with women. So building on that further, we need to think about kind of what are the gendered pathways, what are the things that the Corson report back in 2006, 2007 was starting to highlight. What did she find? So building on those stats, women are more likely to commit acquisitive crimes, so those kind of shoplifting offences, and less likely to commit serious and violent offences. Like I said, we do have some very risky women and high and very high risk women, but proportionately far less. The majority of the women that we manage have committed exactly those type of offences. We need to think about the social and economic context when it comes to women. So women are more likely to experience poverty, be the primary carers of dependent children. Many are victims themselves of domestic or sexual violence, and their offending is more likely than men's to be linked to their relationships. This is something we see a massive trend of. So the majority of the women that we work with, their kind of intimate relationships or important relationships are an absolutely key part of their offending. And it might be that it's directly related, it might be very overt, or it might be once we start to women and we really work with women, and we really start to kind of pick through their experiences and their background, we discover the kind of core links to their position that they find themselves in. Patterns of substance misuse. So women in prison report higher rates of opiate use, so things like heroin and crack cocaine, and the use of often originally legally, but then illegally obtained prescription drugs. So when we're working with women, we have that real complexity in terms of those two different dynamics really around of substance misuse. And later on, I'm just going to talk to you about how we approach working with women and how our intended approach is to work with women. And a big part of that is understanding trauma. And that dynamic around substance misuse is directly related to that. So when we think about the both physical and emotional impact of trauma, those different types, those different pathways around substance misuse are directly related to that and become extremely complex when we try and work with women in terms of access to services, in terms of engagement with us, in terms of ability to address some of those issues. It's a very complex picture, and that's definitely building. Women have high rates of self-harm. When I was doing similar things to this around a year or so ago, I'd be telling you that the rates of self-harm for women are around 5 times higher than that of men. Currently, it's 11 times higher. So in a really short period of time, that has dramatically increased. There's lots of resource going into trying to look at what that is about. How do we understand that dynamic? What is it related to? And how can we address it? There's a higher propensity of depression and anxiety. And again, this is so closely linked to trauma that I made reference to. And they're more likely to have symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress and are more likely than men to have a diagnosed mental illness. So again, that's not to say that men that we work with don't have some of these, but proportionally, we see a significantly high proportion of women amongst the women that we work with that do indeed align with this. And in terms of our discussion today as well, the impact of human trafficking. So women are vulnerable to both sexual exploitation and to coercion into criminal activity. And I'm going to talk more about that and more specifically around the impacts of that, but also some of our approaches to that as we move on. But it's very much starting to think about how that presents, what that exploitation is like in our local communities and nationally, and the dynamic that plays into some of women's circumstances that mean that they're coerced into some criminal activity, and how we manage that. Really relevant for myself actually as a professional when we were working with women during COVID and lockdown, and we had significant issues trying to engage lots of women, and in fact some women just completely disengaged in a way that we've not seen before. And when we looked into that, both locally, worked with partners, as well as engaged with kind of the national discussion around that, what we discovered is that a significant number of women were involved in the sex industry. And some of those had returned to that, some of those had taken it up. And that often was as a result of the kind of financial pressures that they were facing. But what we really picked up on was the vulnerability around that. And I'm going to talk more about that as we move forward. But something that we are really clear on doing, which is being aware of the kind of social context and the impact that has on women. We talked about the social and economic context, and obviously the cost of living has significantly quite often impacted on women. And I certainly, with my kind of overarching view of, say, shoplifting, which, as I said, is our primary offence that we manage women for, what you see is the style of that and the type of that changing. So the number of women that are stealing essential goods as you're required, so nappies, washing, associated goods, things like that has increased dramatically. So not the kind of stereotypical shoplifting to fund substance misuse that we might have seen in the years previous. So understanding that, tracking that, and responding to that is really important. So kind of just to summarise that, in view of lots of those things, women are more likely to be remanded. They're more likely to struggle day to day. They're more likely to, or the courts are quite often more likely to consider that prison might be a place of safety. They're more likely to be recalled. A number of the women that we work with that are released on licence, often in terms of all those kind of chaotic and complex lifestyle issues mean that they struggle to engage with us. And I'll talk more about how we approach that with women. But the one thing I talk about a lot when we work with women is willful and non-willful compliance. And again, proportionately, a significant number of the women that we work with that aren't maybe complying in the way that we need them to are not necessarily doing that willfully. It's not that they lack the motivation to want to engage with us or to make positive changes in their lives. It's often that they are held back, that they experience barriers, that they're struggling day to day to cope. And that presents a real challenge for us at points. But the majority of the significant reason why women are recalled often is due to non-compliance, as opposed to committing further offences or an increase in risk, which with men is our primary reason for recall. They're likely to have poorer outcomes on release. So think about all those different pathways we know are impacting them. Think about what I said before in terms of the greater proportion of women that get short custodial sentences. Think about the average length of a sentence for a woman. That's enough time, isn't it? A few weeks is enough time for your children to have to go and live elsewhere, for you to lose a job that you might have, for your financial income or management to be significantly changed. It's also not enough time in custody to manage some of those things. So really short period of time. And therefore what we see, and thus in terms of policy, a greater focus on resettlement and women's needs when they come out of custody is responding to exactly that. So it's a real acknowledgement that lots of things are destabilised for women in a way that we don't see quite in the same way for some men, or we see in greater proportion for women. And often struggle to secure employment. This is actually proving to be developing positive picture, but previously where women might have occupied some kind of feminized sectors of the community, sort of caring aspects, that what happened as a result of criminal convictions was that to pass vetting and various other checks was extremely difficult for women, and therefore their their ability to find a job was really complex. What Working Chance, which are a national charity that serve to work with women on their employability when they've got convictions, at the end of last year did some research that really evidenced that certain different aspects of the employment industry are more open to, one, employing women, so it opens up more possibilities, but also to employ women that have criminal convictions and being more open to what that looks like. So there's a developing picture of some improvements and some positivity around the opportunities afforded to women. That's certainly something to keep an eye on. I thought you might be interested in what women in prison looks like. So I think that there's kind of around 100-ish male prisons across the UK. There are 12 women's prisons, all that you can see on the map there. 10 are public, 2 are private. So 2 are run by Sodexo, that's Peterborough, and you could argue kind of our most local prison, although not in our probation region, but that's Bronzefield, which is the biggest women's prison in Europe. You'll see as well, it's quite small, so, and you should get the slides afterwards or be able to view the slides, so you can certainly look at this in greater detail. But I thought it might be of interest for you to see where the women in our local area are. So where are the women in West Berkshire? So if you're a woman from West Berkshire, where are you located and what does that mean? So on average, a woman can be placed around 100 miles away from her home location. Really problematic for lots of women in terms of visiting, family members being able to visit, add in the cost of living. So travel costs make that complicated. But you'll see we've got women in Bronzefield and Downview, and then we do have some women as high up north as Boston Hall, kind of Midlands area. We do have women in Send. So we've got women spread out. What you'll notice from that map as well is that there is no women's prisons in Wales. So if you're a woman from Wales, you are going to be placed significantly far away from your home location, your family, your support networks. And whilst I would never advocate for increased women's prisons, because that's what we don't want, at the same time, the dynamic and the distance away, when we think all the way back to that policy that I talked about from 2019 and the Farmer Review and the importance of strengthening those family ties for women to aid their rehabilitation, this is a complex picture in terms of how far women might be located. 6 of the women's prisons that you see on the slide have mother and baby units. So these are specific facilities within the prison that enable some women, given safeguarding measures, just the same as they would be in the community, that all is well, can keep their babies with them up until the age of around 18 months, potentially 2 years, but definitely not anything beyond that. And the expectations are there that the women will maintain prison regime. There's creche facilities, there's support available, but certainly evidentially, and again related to trauma, and the cellular kind of basis of trauma and building of trauma for children, there is a huge amount of evidence to say the importance of the bond and the ability for the child to stay with their mother. Equally, that evidence is exactly the reason why that changes at 18 months and 2 years, and why different measures are put in place to enable that. Women's prisons aren't categorised, so you might be aware that there is different categories in terms of the alphabet. So A, B, C, and D for men, A being the highest security category in terms of risk, and D being an open prison for men. We don't have that generally for women. We have a couple of open prisons. You'll see further up north in Askham Grange, which is a prison near York. That is an open prison, for example. But generally, if you're a woman, you'll go into a prison that has a variety of categories of cases. So you might be the kind of highest level, you might be serving a life sentence, or you might also be a woman who, as I've talked about, is serving a short sentence for something like shoplifting. So hopefully there, a bit of an overview of what that looks like. The remand population, and I'm sure lots of people have heard about the kind of numbers in prison generally, which has been less impactful for the women's estate. The greater focus has been on men. But the remand capacity is something that we should be aware of and conscious of. So Bronzefield, our local prison, for example, is a remand prison. Not all take women on remand. And currently 85% of Bronzefield's population is those that are being remanded. So something to really think about in terms of that cycle and the short times that looked after. I've noticed your question there, Sue, around Holloway. Holloway shut around, which is a really relevant and important question, shut, I want to say 2015, something like that, 2016. So really relevancy, thank you. The Bronzefield now takes the majority of London women, or they're spread to somewhere like Downview, which is also on the outskirts of London. That the closure of Holloway significantly impacted the women's population and continues to do so. So something to keep an eye on. Okay, hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of women in prison. I wanted very briefly to just give you a bit of a profile of women in Thames Valley, some of the themes we might see and what we're seeing, which is part of my role, to think about the profile of the women and therefore how we can respond using the exact principles really of going back to the Corston report. So you can see how many women roughly we've got in Thames Valley at any given time. I also oversee Hampshire, and we have a similar number of women in Hampshire. Actually, their profiles are pretty similar. Something we're pulling out just lately that seems to be a change, certainly in my time of overseeing women, is that around 26% of the women that we're working with are aged between 40 and 49. So we're seeing a big increase in that age bracket. Nationally, we know that this age bracket features a kind of larger number than any other bracket of first-time entrants into the criminal justice system. So people that are not convicted prior to that point, with a higher kind of frequency of kind of medical or health issues and potentially some psychiatric issues. And that's something that we're keeping a very close eye on in terms of how we respond to that, both nationally and locally. A high proportion of the women that we're working with have disclosed kind of being a victim of domestic abuse. So really building into that kind of national picture of a high proportion of the women that we're working with have experienced that. We know that women are more likely, as I've told you before, to have a higher propensity for health inequalities, so a higher rate of self-harm, eating disorders, diagnosis of depression and anxiety. And in Thames Valley, 62% of the women that we work with have described themselves as having a disability in that respect. So that being one of the core focuses. That's in comparison to around 40% of men. So you're talking almost a kind of third higher overall in the women's population. So that's something we really focus on. 37% of the women that we are working with are those that have had particularly punitive sentences, more likely to have received custody, and those that are also assessed as not posing any significant risk to others, but have also received a short custodial sentence. So we keep a very close eye on kind of who are the women that we're working with, what are the needs presented, and we do that on a kind of Thames Valley focus, but we also think about what that looks like more locally. So what are we seeing in West Berkshire? There you'll see the number of women that we're managing overall in West Berkshire, and a growing population again within the population of Berkshire, West Berkshire, sorry, who are over 40 and lightly convicted. So there's that kind of feeding into that national lens, I think, is really important. We're looking at how we have a greater focus on health, thinking about health, thinking about nutrition, thinking about hormones, thinking about menopause, and just trying to think about how we can respond to those needs. Think about really one of the things that the Corson report really brought out in a way that we don't quite see in exactly the same way for men is all those different complexities that are kind of very much underneath the headline, or what we can see before us in terms of their reason for being in the criminal justice system. And certainly what we're finding is that women's understanding that we have contact with around the importance of the link between health and nutrition and their hormonal balance or hormonal cycle is a really developing picture. And a lot of women are echoing our concerns that they are not as aware of some of those dynamics and the importance of it in terms of behaviour presentation. So what do we see as well in terms of sentencing in West Berkshire? So a third of the women that we're working with have received a custodial sentence. So they're at various stages of that. They might still be in custody. They might be on licence where they're at risk of going back to custody if they don't stick to certain rules and requirements. So a real significant proportion of the women that we're working with, another third of those are also subject to suspended sentence orders where they're given custody, but that's suspended for a period in the community, again, reliant upon their ability to comply with the rules and the restrictions and the needs placed upon them. So those women are also at risk of custody if that doesn't happen or they find difficulty in that. When we're thinking about needs, certainly their kind of thinking and their emotional behaviour are the highest needs that we identify. That's absolutely what we see in terms of evidentially nationally. So really thinking about their ability to regulate the things that they might be impacted on and how that impacts then their ability to think. And we're going to, like I've said before, we're going to think about kind of trauma and the impact neurologically, which certainly for me as a practitioner has revolutionized how I think about things and how we respond. At no point is it as us excusing behaviour that warrants access into the criminal justice system, but it very much provides a different lens for us to think about how we respond. And I do think that that is really important. So women in exploitation, a big focus, a big theme amongst the women that we're working with, and we are very aware, and I've put that headline there, there's a complex interplay between vulnerability and offending. We can't manage the women that we're working with without a really good understanding that a lot of them are victims themselves. Again, not to detract from the fact that they are with us for a reason, and that has been through a process, but it's really important for us to think about what that looks like in order to help them address that, work through that, and obviously reduce the likelihood of reoffending and harm to others, but also to themselves. And I just put this quote in at the end. Stephanie Covington at the end there is a big advocate. She's a professional from America who does a lot of work around women in the criminal justice system and trauma. And she talks about the most common pathways to crime are based on survival and substance misuse, and that, you know, the interplay between those two aspects, but also the importance of our understanding of that is really important for enabling us to enable others to make positive changes and to support and work through people in those scenarios. So I thought specifically that we would have a bit of a spotlight on women in the sex industry, because for me, this is definitely an area of passion of mine in terms of understanding. I think it's something that's often unseen, and actually that's really demonstrated in the data for women in the sex industry is notably kind of hard to get hold of. And so those kind of tangible actions in relation to women is certainly a constant information gathering exercise. But what we do know is that kind of current evidence along that frame points to a kind of increase in the number of people selling sex. And that's something that we need to work with and consider. And like I reflected, that certainly we saw that during lockdown in response to that kind of social context that was going on at the time, but also the provisions that were put in place, giving you an example of housing people in line with COVID, changed the dynamic of how some of those things happen and the vulnerabilities that we needed to understand. So I've put up this piece of information around those that work in the sex industry face enhanced risks, that kind of physical and sexual violence, the psychological harm, the mental health risks, and the vulnerability to wider exploitation is significant. Many experience financial and housing and drug and alcohol misuse issues. And as such, those people in those scenarios need a various support and require a range of different kind of approaches. And, you know, I put in that BBC News headline that was from a few years ago now, but certainly has been a frequent headline. And there were significant headlines through the back of lockdown, which nationally acknowledged this change. And we have to think about this in the kind of social and economic context. We have to think about what's visible and what isn't visible, but also earlier when I was talking about the kind of willful and non-willful compliance of some women, we need to think about the understanding of their experiences in their day-to-day lives in terms of their ability to comply with us or do what the court requires of them, brings some significant challenges. And the balance from our point of view around the boundaries of that, of what needs to be completed, but also our understanding of that is significantly important in terms of how we respond and how we do our best to support women in these scenarios. And within that, talking about sexual exploitation is really important. So that kind of actual attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, so that different power or breach of power and trust for kind of sexual purposes, and what that means for some of the women that we're working with. I've included there a specific definition around survival sex, as this is something that's becoming certainly more talked about amongst a number of kind of statutory agencies, and definitely is something we see amongst the women that we're working with. So that's selling or exchanging sex for food, shelter, drugs or alcohol, pay bills or safety. And the framing around that is really important, and it's a big area of work that we do with a number of women, which is kind of understanding that kind of transactional focus, the impact on them as individuals, the vulnerabilities and the risks that are taken or they're placed in, but ultimately is that real understanding that when someone is in that position and they feel like selling sex is their only option, to ensure that they can meet their needs, what the impacts of that is and how we can particularly support women in those scenarios. And we talk about their kind of one of the pieces of work that we might do with women is thinking about their emotional baggage, but also their baggage of safety. Kind of what are they doing to look after themselves? How are they keeping themselves safe? And where possible, how can we help them to exit when absolutely that needs to be an option? So real kind of the understanding around the day-to-day impact on this is really significant. And I wanted to bring in a colleague, DCI Ben Henley, who will introduce himself. Him and I had a discussion. Unfortunately, he's not able to make it today. So him and I had a discussion, and I recorded it. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. It focuses on the work that we've done together, our joint roles and passion around ensuring that we are aware of certain vulnerable women in our communities, and how we've approached that from a prison and police perspective. So I'll play that for you now. You found that conversation between DCI, Ben Henley and myself helpful in terms of the themes that we talked about, exploitation, safeguarding, but also importantly, one of the provisions or the frameworks that's set up. Hopefully you might have heard of it or been aware. If not, hopefully you are clearer now or know about it if you didn't before. And I thought I would just share what the framework is around sex worker action groups and what our focus is really. And I talked earlier about the level of exploitation around the difficulty around data, and that's definitely one of the purposes of this framework. Absolutely, the core process is to focus on the individual women. But as part of that, we recognise that we would identify new and emerging issues, that we would develop an understanding of how it was presenting in a local area. And a really good example of that and the differences is I can give you between the Reading swag that we hold and the Slough swag that we hold, is that the women that we talk about on each of those groups present very differently. So very much in Reading, for example, there's quite an on-street presence, but there's also some behind closed doors aspects of working that we focus on. In Slough, almost all of it is behind closed doors and is a demonstration of what I've talked about before in terms of lockdown and government response to that and housing provisions. So some of those women we were aware might have been on street working and now potentially working from their own properties. Both swags demonstrate significant vulnerabilities and areas for exploitation. There's certainly in Slough greater substance misuse movement. People might be thinking about county lines, for example. So where that happens, there's significantly more women involved in that area, for example. But these forums are there to respond to that. So it's about how we work as a multi-agency forum, how we pull our great minds together to think about how we can reduce harm, how we can have a focus on exit routes. That's always our focus. But as Ben and I talked about, it's absolutely about the sharing of information. Where are those? How do we connect the dots? How do we fill up that puzzle of the picture of what's going on for a particular woman? And how can we all have a greater awareness of the opportunities to engage those women with a view to reducing the harm that we think they might be at risk at, or we know they're at risk at. It's about increasing the access to services, identifying the gaps, and that looks different in different areas. There in our Bucks discussion, for example, there is every 2 weeks there is a collective group of professionals that go out and walk to try and come across some of the women that are the most vulnerable, and kind of accessing those and the response to that, thinking about harm reduction, thinking about their safety is absolutely the focus. So part of that discussion is how we utilise that as best as possible. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a really good rounded view. At the bottom, we've also talked about holding an emergency meeting, but I also reflected in my discussion with DCI Ben Henley about when we might share networking issues, or issues that we can share as a network, which means we can respond differently as and when they're kind of the most risky or we have the most concerns. And that is proving particularly effective. Okay, Hopefully that was helpful. What I thought I might do is just give you a bit of a rounded view of a profile of women that we might be working with who, and this is clearly anonymized, and actually I've pulled details from different people, but to kind of give you an idea of what it might be like for us when we're presented with a woman. And then shortly I'll be bringing in one of our key practitioners who's worked with women for a period of time, just to give you greater context to that. But we've talked about the types of offences that women might receive. We might be talking about their experiences and our understanding of that and the dynamics related to that. So we might have a woman in her 30s who's got a history of shoplifting to support substance misuse, often with a male. First convicted at age 20, so we're talking about kind of a good 14, 15 years of being involved in the criminal justice system. What I didn't add in here is that it's not uncommon to have periods of time where people aren't involved in the criminal justice system. So a number of our women might have 5 or 6 years or so where they're not involved, and us looking at that, delving into that, and being clear about what the mechanisms around that period of time that enabled them to move away from that lifestyle associates or kind of criminal activity is really important. As we talked about in terms of women, and one of the things that we see is a link with their relationships when working with us. They might tell us that a partner is pressuring them to sell substances, and they also might be known to probation. So it's not uncommon for us to be managing partners of the women that we're working with. We have concerns potentially in those scenarios that partner might be controlling. And we also know that lots of these women, as we talked about in terms of that statistic, have a history of that, of abusive relationships. So really acknowledging that vulnerability, that homelessness, so that real destabilizing of factors. And that, I think, is due to multiple different reasons in terms of why those circumstances might occur. Thinking about some of these women as a mother, this has become really prevalent to me just lately, but we're just thinking about how that feels to some of the women when they might have a child that they're not able to see, but they might be able to see at certain periods of time, causes real complexities in terms of relationships with families, but how the women view themselves, that kind of, we might talk about toxic shame that they might experience, that they have kind of almost doubly gone against the standards of what you might expect of a woman as a mother in terms of their influence in the criminal justice system. The complexity we manage quite often is that will fuel their continued substance misuse, their kind of inability to deal with that. So quite often, as we talked about the intel sharing in our discussion with DCI Ben Henley, it's about, we might get information that suggests that someone is engaging in survival sex to support often her own and her partner's substance misuse. Huge pressure, significant impact in terms of the choices that might be placed upon that person, and the circumstances and the risks that they might take in order to fulfill that. Diagnosis of anxiety and depression, I talked about the higher prevalence of that earlier on amongst the women that we're working with. And then what we quite often see is sporadic medication. So with the kind of sporadic and chaotic lifestyle, you've also got access to services come in and out of scope at different points. And evidently, that then is a cycle of impacting their behaviour. So those areas might be where those symptoms aren't managed and deemed appropriate to do by medication. Their ability to manage those things become really difficult. And lastly, I was just talking about engagement being varied, and I've talked a couple of times now about willful and non-willful compliance, and I just think it's really how we frame this is a complexity, and I'll talk to our officer shortly about how that might look, but we operate to the same standards, and so that we would do for men. We have things that we need to comply, but our ability to think about what might be going on for a woman that might be placing some barriers in place for her ability to comply is a really important area of our practice. And what we do see in the example I've given here is that when they do attend, they absolutely demonstrate that need to want to engage. Their ability to be able to do so might be significantly hindered, and our understanding of that is really important. Okay, just a very quick snapshot of what a woman might look like. And these next couple of slides, we're gonna build on more when we talk to a colleague, but I just wanted to give you an idea about how our approaches from probation. So how we try and adopt that kind of gendered and trauma-informed approach to working with women. And that's done by having a specialist women's team. So across our whole region, we have a team of women working with women specifically. We have specific interventions that are written for women, taking account of their different needs. I'm going to talk to you a bit and just really summarise being trauma informed shortly, but that approach is something that we are on a journey, I would say. It's a complex one in terms of how we are, if you're ever truly fully trauma informed, but I think it's certainly a premise that we try our best to adopt within a punitive framework, and that's definitely one of the complexities. We link in with other women's services, and I want to spotlight right at the end Alana House, in case anyone isn't aware of that, but our importance of us being, and you'll see the one woman, one plan being at the centre of what we do, but the importance of us being really aware that we can't do it on our own and that we need to have that whole system approach, that kind of real working together. An example of which is the sex worker action groups. What forums, how can we operate like that as and when we need to? Court engagement, we're obviously always trying to link in with the courts, think about how we can best provide the history of a woman, our assessment of that woman, and what sentence might work towards reduction of reoffending and likelihood of reoffending, reduction of harm. And obviously, throughout all of our work, we're always thinking about how we can protect the public. Risk leads our decisions, and supporting the victims. So really, for us, it's about kind of being innovative. How within a framework that we've got, can we do something different? Can we be creative? Can we think holistically? For me, really importantly, can we be empathic? Can we have an understanding of the journey of that woman to that point, and how can we respond to that? And in doing so, how are we pulling other agencies together to provide that support? How are we coordinating what that might look like? I said that I would just touch on kind of being trauma informed because I think it's really important. And I would reflect that as a practitioner myself, that understanding the neurological impact of trauma, it has been crucial in terms of the way that we then might respond. So that being trauma informed about means being able to recognise when someone might be affected by trauma, collaboratively adjusting how we work to take that into account, and responding in a way that supports recovery, does no harm, and recognises and supports people's resilience. So twofold really, we're not excusing people's behaviour, but having that understanding the neurology of how your brain responds differently as a result of trauma is crucial to how we might work with people to remove them or move them away from the criminal justice system. Also, what we need to acknowledge within that are a number of the people, as much as we've talked today about vulnerability and exploitation, are come to us with amazing strength and amazing resilience, and our recognition of that is also really important, and how we harness that, how we strengthen that with people in order to make more robust decision making in their lives, in order to help them solve some of the problems that face them. And what I would do, this is a big area and I'm sure it's familiar to lots of you, but what I wanted to do is just talk through that picture of the brain and think about how trauma affects the brain, just to headline what might be happening for some of these people in the circumstances. So when you're reminded of a traumatic experience, your amygdala, which is your emotional and survival center, goes into overdrive, and it acts just as it would if you were experiencing that trauma for the first time. Your prefrontal cortex also becomes suppressed, so you're less capable of controlling your fear and you're stuck in a reactive state. Meanwhile, that trauma also leads to reduced activity in the hippocampus, one of whose functions is to distinguish between past and present. In other words, your brain can't tell the difference between the actual traumatic event and the memory of it. It perceives it, it perceives things that trigger memories of traumatic events as threats in themselves. So trauma can cause your brain to remain in a state of hypervigilance, suppressing your memory and impulse control, and trapping you in a constant state of strong emotional reactivity. Like I say, a very brief overview of how the different parts of the brain manage that trauma and what we then might see. in terms of the presentation of that. And that has to be at the forefront of our mind when we're working with women. There's a lot more conversation around this, to which we expand to what are the common behaviours that we might see, how we might frame them as potentially negative, the language we might use. Instead of suggesting kind of what is wrong with this person, what's happened to them, is crucial in terms of how we then progress to the next steps of how we might work with a particular woman. So what I want to do now is call in my colleague Mairead. Hopefully she's with us.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can. Thank you, Mairead. I can't see you, but that might be technology. Thanks for joining us, Mairead.
I've got my camera on. I'm not sure what's happened there.
Oh, no, I can see you now. Thank you,
Okay.
Mairead. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. So before we go any further, Mairead, can I just ask you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Mairead. So I've worked in probation for 12 years. And about 9 years ago, I joined the women's team in probation, and but just more recently, I've now joined the performance and quality team, but still invested in how we work with women. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Mairead. A firm basis. You were alongside me to give the context around kind of starting off what I described at the beginning of this as quite a revolutionary way of working with women, right? Prior
it
to
was.
that, and when you first came in, for sure, we didn't work with women specifically. And I don't just mean having women-specific officers, actually, although that's a model that I think we've proven, hopefully, is working well and is important, but actually thinking about women differently
Yeah.
wasn't something we did in a kind of consistent and kind of curious way before that point. And so I think we've now going into year 10 of doing that, which I'm really proud of. And you were certainly a key part of that. So thinking more about your role and your experience of women, kind of how would you describe the women that you've worked with present kind of differently, or what's different about working with women than men?
So in my experience, women are a lot more open, so they'll come to appointments and basically they wear their heart on their sleeve. Well, the majority of women, they will just come into the appointment and literally tell you their whole life story. It's like they've unfortunately they just don't have that boundary, and we see that in the waiting room where they see like other people, and then they're just telling them like their offense or what trauma they've been through, and there isn't that boundary. So they present as really complex. There's a lot of issues going on for them, but actually, for me, I just feel like it's easier to work with what it's easier to work with that because they're so open and honest, and you're able then to help them. You're able to identify what their needs are more easily, and then support them through that.
Absolutely. And in terms of kind of what we've been talking about today and that kind of vulnerability and kind of exploitation that we know happens a lot amongst the women we've worked with, and I've talked about a high proportion of the women we've been working with are victims themselves. Kind of, I wondered how you've approached that dynamic, because obviously we have a job to do in terms of fulfilling the order of the court or the sentence, but also the key to progressing that is that understanding. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I suppose going back to them coming into the probation office, for example, and maybe meeting people and opening up to them, and then potentially making themselves more vulnerable to people in the other men in the waiting room, for example, or even other women. And you spoke about being trauma informed. Luckily, in Milton Keynes, where I worked, where I'm based, we had a women's centre, so I was able to offer appointments at the women's centre rather than in the probation office. And I just felt like obviously we're really lucky to have that, but the difference seeing a woman in the Milton Keynes probation office in comparison to seeing them in the women's centre, it was so different. Like you could just see how much more relaxed they are when we saw them in the women's centre. The environment was so much nicer than the probation office, which is right next door to the court, which can obviously trigger trauma responses in itself. So obviously I think we've got a long way to go in terms of being fully trauma informed. Like you said, I don't know if it's going to be ever impossible for probation to do that, but we're able to, like with that facility, we're able to be a bit more trauma informed and then work. I think our work is more successful when we're seeing them in that different environment where they're more relaxed, where, yeah, I hope I've answered that question.
Absolutely. I think it's what for me you framed is kind of both the principles of being trauma informed. So that real thought about a safe environment, which is about your relationship with them, actually, isn't it? That kind of psychological safety. But it's also about the environment in which you see them that can facilitate that safety, which for me then responds to that vulnerability.
Yeah.
So if we know that, what we want to do is glean lots of information from some of these women to be able to support them in the best way we can, with the ultimate goal to reduce harm and likelihood of reoffending. But I think one of the things that happens with women, and I've certainly, having observed your practice, definitely seen this, is that we go about that in a different way.
Yeah.
So it's a building that resilience, building that kind of self-identity, understanding that, really reminding some of the women of their strengths, then moves us to the next. Almost there's like a level underneath, isn't there, with lots of women that we don't see quite as frequently. Definitely see it with men, but don't see quite as frequently, which then enables them to be in a position to think about how they could better solve a problem, that they might be faced with, or what solutions they can have.
Yeah, I think working the toolkits that we use with women are really strength based, aren't they? So we're able to, and also when you're building up that relationship with someone and you see you get to know them more and get to know their interests, you can really run with that, and and also if they think that you believe in them, they believe more in themselves to be able to then go and achieve their goals. And also the toolkits help us to do that, because the toolkits are aimed at improving their self-esteem, their confidence, which is quite often lacking because of the trauma they've experienced in the past, or just because they've been judged as a result of their offence, for example.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, actually, Mairead, in terms of judgment. And definitely, I think we see that all the time when women present to us that are mothers. They worry about our judgment upon them, that the judgment they're already placing on themselves. When we think about women in the sex industry, it's a particularly difficult area, isn't it? And how we present that conversation with some of those women, how they can safely disclose to us that they might be in those scenarios, and then how we respond. Because you talked about the toolkit, that one of the main toolkit that we use with women, which covers multiple areas, but has a particular section on women in the sex work industry, doesn't it? And focuses on reducing harm, not just saying don't do that anymore, which I think is really important.
Yeah, it's helping them to keep themselves safe. So in that, using that in that session of using the toolkit, we don't judge. There's no, oh, we don't think you should do that. There's no opinion given by the practitioner. It's literally just going through a checklist of how they can keep themselves safe, and making sure that they're thinking of the potential risks that they may be getting into. So making sure that they've told someone where they're going, that that they've got certain things in their bag that they're carrying to, to help them keep themselves as safe as possible. Because I think they don't need that additional judgment. And if you're saying to them, they do it for a number of different reasons, don't they? And I don't think judging them is gonna make them stop. So it's just about helping them to be safe.
Absolutely. And I think that the way that you and other members of the women's team kind of enable that environment, facilitate those conversations, means that you're more likely, and I know you definitely have had women then come to you and say, I need your help now because
Yeah.
I've reached this point, or this has happened, or I'm worried about this. And they're the little opportunities that we almost need to maintain our position whilst trying to also safeguard the women as much as we can as we go along.
Yeah, it's building up that trust, isn't it? And I think, yeah, definitely with the help of the toolkits, if you can see them in a different environment other than the office, I think building up that relationship, building up that trust, they're more likely to even because sometimes with women as well, they come in and they're like telling you all this stuff, but not telling you anything. Does that make
Mhm.
sense? So it's like it's kind of like something, they're masking something, but then like you say, when you've built up that relationship and that trust, actually then they can come and tell you when they really do need help with something.
Mm, absolutely. You put that really nicely in terms of a lot of the information that we gather on people isn't necessarily told us to us overtly, right? We're
Yeah.
putting things together. In the conversation that I was having with DCI Ben Henley, he was talking about the intelligence gathering, and that's almost what we do as an agency ourselves, isn't it? But are also reliant on other agencies to give that to us to create that picture. And that isn't to kind of gung ho go in and address that. That's just to think about how we can best support that person in that scenario.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. One of the things I've talked about as well is the complexities, and you alluded to it as well around kind of trauma-informed practice. But I just wondered what your perspective has been on how we work to the same standards. As an organisation, we have the standards, whether whoever you are that's current to probation. So how would you describe how you might have employed some of those things differently? Things like enforcement, so where we mark the fact that people haven't done what's required or come into appointments as we've requested. How might you, or how have you approached that differently with women who might be in circumstances like that we've discussed today in terms of the sex industry to that of we might with men?
um I think we're in our team, in the women's team, we're definitely more flexible. And it's just about demonstrating that professional curiosity about about why they might have failed to attend that appointment. Have they got, we need to be open-minded, have they got a partner at home that's abusive, and that they they haven't allowed them to come into an appointment, for example. I think also other things to take into consideration that you wouldn't for men are and I know we're doing a lot of work around it at the moment, Helen, but like um hormones and different things like that as well. We have to take that into consideration, and where they are in their cycle potentially, and women's health issues. I'm trying to think of other examples of where of where childcare issues, they're
Yeah.
normally like the main the main person that looks after the children, so we really have to be flexible in terms of appointments as well in that sense. I'm trying to think. I
No,
don't
absolutely. I think all of those things mean are not presuming that someone just doesn't care. And I
yeah,
think that that's something you have to very consciously do. That evidently, if people don't come to appointments or engage with us in a way that we need them to, it has some serious consequences. And
yeah,
I think it's ensuring that we emphasize those and the importance of them, that we execute them, because that's our jobs, isn't it? To ensure that someone fulfills the order of the court, but also that we're not presuming that they just don't care.
yeah. I
Because I
think
think few women don't care. Is that your
yeah,
experience? Yeah.
yeah, definitely. And also like you might find that with like class A drug users as well. Just being mindful of like that is their priority at that time, and why are they using them drugs? It's to to self-medicate because they've been through trauma, and to forget about some of the stuff that they've experienced. I'm not saying that that's okay, but we do have to bear that in mind when we're working with them. And that, we have to remember that their priority at that time is trying to get well if they're withdrawing, by going out and getting drugs. But from my experience, they don't want to use drugs. Like, it's an addiction, and they don't wake up every day saying, I want to use drugs. It's got a hold on them. And I just think, just being mindful of that as well. Like, obviously we do have to enforce, and we do have to put boundaries in place. And actually, I think that's the most important thing, actually, with working with women, is having them clear and firm boundaries, because it makes them feel safe as well. So they know the expectations that we have on them, but also they have an opportunity to tell them what they expect from us when we're doing that work around boundaries, with them in our initial appointments, when you're building up that relationship with them.
Absolutely. That's a really nice way to put it. Thank you, Mairead. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you
No
joining
problem.
us. Thanks.
Thanks.
Right. Hopefully that's interesting and helpful. Mairead has a wealth of experience of working with women, and I think certainly her reflections are really insightful and nice for us to hear. Just to kind of start to bring things to a close, and Mairead nicely mentioned about in her area how there is a women's centre. So certainly a goal of ours is to think about other spaces that might be more comfortable, risk permitting, that we could see women, that they might access other services, and the difference that we find in that woman's engagement with us and the conversations we have and our ability to help them and manage them to the best of our ability, really. And so it would be remiss of me to not mention Alana House in Reading. I have a video, but apologies, some IT issues mean that I'm not able to show that to you. But what I'll do in terms of you getting the slides is I'll make sure that the link is in there for you. It's just a few minutes that gives a bit of a tour and an understanding of what they offer. But going back to what I was talking about before around a commitment from across agencies and sectors working that come into contact with women, and the importance of us all working together to get the best out of women, to reduce that likelihood of reoffending and risk of harm to others, but also to themselves. And how we can harness those places of safety, how we can ensure people are aware of those places of safety and the multiple different services and offers within that setting. And Alana House is a brilliant project. They are experts at working and supporting women. The dynamic for us in probation is also really helpful because they're not probation. And I think that the balance between us working with how we can facilitate that access for women and offer that support, but in a way that isn't strictly probation, is also much more comfortable for women. And we need to acknowledge that at points, that those sources of support and the way in which women are supported needs to come in different forms as well in terms of increasing success. But I just wanted to spotlight Alana House in itself. Just drawing to a close there, really. I've included some kind of further reading if people wanted to investigate for themselves, which I hope you will. But ultimately, just to thank you very much for your attention and time. I hope it's been interesting.